Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. It really is nice to be here. And I was speaking, there are some people in the audience who spoke with me about getting me here to Prague 5 years ago. So it's taken 5 years, but now I'm delighted to be here. And I think it's wonderful that such a broad range of people from across the country, and I think beyond, from many different disciplines are coming together. Now, as you've heard, I've been lucky enough, I'm a writer and researcher, and I was given a grant to look at what different cities have done to make them, to become more child-friendly. And I'm going to share with you, hot off the press, the results of my research. So I'm really excited to do this. I have 2 diagrams for you. 2 diagrams, not 1, 2. So look out for those. But first, I want to, just like Nicola, I want you to think about your own experiences for a minute. Only this time, I want you to think about where you used to play when you were a child. And I want you to picture in your mind one place that you would say was your favorite place to play when you were younger. And just as Nicola did, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and describe that place to them, okay? So I'm going to give you about 1 minute and 17 seconds because Mirjana is on my back. So you haven't got long. So your favorite place to play when you were a child, off you go. Thank you. And so now I'm going to ask for a little bit of feedback, and we're towards the end of the day. The energy levels are getting a little bit low. And we all know, I think, we heard about obesity earlier. So in case you didn't know this, sitting is the new smoking. Okay, we are all sitting too much. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. And each time, if the answer to the question is yes, I want you to stand up. Okay? First question. Was your favorite place to play out of doors? Was it outside? Okay. We can see the general answer. Thank you very much. You can sit down again. Second question. Was your favorite place to play somewhere that was not directly supervised by adults? Okay. Maybe even more yeses for that second question. Thank you. Now, I know that the nostalgia bell is ringing loudly now, and, you know, especially people of a certain age, we talk a lot about how great it was when we were young. I think it's too quick to dismiss these memories. I guessed the answers to those questions. I guessed what you were going to say, and we haven't got enough time to do a survey, but I'm going to guess the kind of places you were talking about. You were probably talking about the woods, the forests near where you lived, rivers, maybe vacant lots, yes, building sites, maybe ponds or lakes, natural places. Maybe if you had a big garden, you were talking about the tree at the bottom of the garden. Maybe you were talking about the street, although not a play street like Nicholas Street. I'm a fan of play streets, but a street that was just there for you to play. So the reason I do this exercise is that I want to remind you of what I think of as a vital ingredient of a good childhood, which is having a taste of freedom, having some space and time where you were able to go where your imagination and your inclination took you, and where the concerns of adults faded into the background. And you could explore, you could test yourselves, you could create new worlds. And I know that the world is a different place today, but I would still say that children today also deserve a taste of freedom. And that, in fact, having the chance to take some responsibility for ourselves, to feel what it's like to be in control, to get the hang of being a human being is still a vital part of this sort of journey that we all go on in childhood, which is a journey that starts where children are completely dependent on adults and ends up, hopefully, with, you know, a confident, competent, capable, responsible, resilient person. And you only go on that journey if the adults, parents, teachers, everyone else, if we allow children to take that responsibility. And that process is best done in a series of gradual steps. And if we make any of these steps too great, then children will struggle. So, I'm talking about child-friendliness, and I'm talking about cities, and many of us here, in different ways, we think about cities and how they are shaped. And we kind of see cities from this kind of view. But if we are a child, and indeed many people, actually we look at cities and we experience cities at this level, yes? About this level. That's where we experience cities from. So I want to invite you to do that as part of your thinking this afternoon. So I talked earlier about how childhood has been changing, and my next slide, I think, helps to illustrate one profound change in the nature of childhood. So what you're looking at here is a map, and on the map you can see there's some shaded areas, and these shaded areas show you what you might call the roaming range or the home territory of 4 children who are 8 years old. But they are 4 children who are in 4 generations of the same family, and they all grew up in the same city. So this big blob that takes up most of the map, that's the roaming range of the great-grandfather in this family. He could travel 10 kilometers across the city on his own. And then you can see the 2 smaller circles, so grandfather and then the mother in this family, again at the age of 8. And then this dot here, that's the roaming range, the home territory of the 8-year-old today in this family. And in fact, he's allowed to go to the end of his street. But we know, in fact, that most 8-year-olds in England, they're not allowed outside their houses. Now, so it's an emotive phrase, but what you're seeing here is that many children today, and this is, of course, this is one child or one family, but this is true of many children, are effectively reared in captivity. And I think this is one of the most profound and underexplored changes in the nature of childhood. And I was intrigued to hear just a month ago at a conference called Child in the City in Vienna, exactly the same findings in Austria. So you're seeing this pattern across the world. And I think what gets me out of bed in the mornings and doing what I do is reflecting on and responding to this change. So that's why I want to move the focus away from just play in the sense of, you know, a sort of fairly narrowly defined set of activities that often happen in, or maybe we think happen in 1 or 2 different types of places, and think about what I call everyday freedoms, the everyday freedoms of childhood. So, what is a child-friendly city? We've seen the term mentioned a few times today. The most common definition, I would say, comes from UNICEF and from the UNICEF Child-Friendly Cities framework. And it talks about children being involved in the decisions of the city, being involved in the governance, and having a view, and the city taking children's views into account. My definition is a different one. My definition is about children's everyday experiences of the city, and how much are children active and visible in the life of the city. So here's a nice, this is not one of my diagrams are coming up later. This is another diagram. And what it shows you is we're looking at the elements and the dimensions of a child-friendly city. And there are 2 dimensions. One is one we've heard a lot about already, which is lots of things to do. So the more things to do, the better. You can go to the playground, you can experience nature, you can play sport, you can, maybe if you're lucky, go to an adventure playground. That's one axis, but there's also this axis down here. You can see it's children's independent mobility. That's a fancy way of saying how easy is it for children to get around their neighbourhoods, especially to get around on foot or by bicycle, because of course children cannot drive. One of the fundamental differences with children. So it's only when you have a lot of choice of things to do, a lot of offers, and children have the independent mobility, have the freedom to get to those choices, that you have a child-friendly city or a child-friendly neighbourhood. So that's my answer, my definition. And it's quite similar to what others have talked about. But you can see it's a shift away from just focusing on play spaces. And really, it's looking at the whole neighbourhood and the whole city. Oh, so here's a quote that I use a lot. And it's Enrique Peñalosa, the mayor of Bogota, who's really gone to incredible lengths to transform the prospects of that city. And he talks about children being an indicator species for cities. In the same way that if you see salmon, yes, fish swimming up a river, you know that's a sign of the quality of that environment. He's saying if you see children of different ages, with and without their parents, active and visible in the city, that's the sign of the health of that habitat. And interestingly, some of you maybe who've done work on children's participation will have heard of Roger Hart. Roger Hart is really the godfather of participatory planning with children. And he's very well known for his ladder of participation. But what he's saying here is, maybe those of us who promote children's participation have talked too much about formal participation, asking children for their views about a park or a play space. And we haven't paid enough attention to what he calls children informal participation in the life of the city. And I agree with Roger Hart. I think we need to pay more attention to the texture and fabric of children's everyday lives. Another quote that's going in the same way, from Colin Ward, who's really one of the first thinkers to explore what it means for children to grow up in a city, talking about not wanting a childhood city, a city that's got spaces with primary coloured pieces of plastic and steel. He wants a city where children live in the same world that he does. And again, I share that vision of what a city that's good for children is like. So that's not to say that I don't care what children think. I do care what children think. And actually, if we ask children what they think about cities, what they like and what they don't like, around the world, wherever you go, whichever children you ask, in whatever city, this is pretty much what they say. They like, guess what, choice and freedom, places to meet their friends, variety and greenery, yes, green spaces, and they don't like traffic and places that are obviously unloved and uncared for. So you might say, isn't it about time we stopped asking children what they want from cities and about time we started doing something about it? So, if we slightly shift the focus and think not so much about child-friendly but family-friendly cities, because after all, when it comes to children's experiences of the city, especially as they're younger, when children's experiences are very strongly shaped by their parents' views and decisions and choices. So I'm just going to say a word here about what makes a neighbourhood family-friendly. And I choose the word neighbourhood carefully. Again, children and families don't live in a city. They live in a neighbourhood. The vast majority of a family's time is not spent with the city as their territory. It's spent with a fairly small and defined neighbourhood. So Brent Toderian, who used to be the chief planner of Vancouver, one of the cities that I visited, he talks about the kind of three pillars or the three platforms of a family-friendly neighbourhood. One of those is housing. Again, we've heard this earlier. If there aren't suitable, affordable places for families to live, homes, apartments, then that's game over. But families also want good services, good schools, good childcare, health services. And again, if those are not in place in a neighbourhood, then the families will not stay, or people who want to have children will move away. But the third element, that's the element I'm interested in, is what we might call the public realm, the public spaces, the streets, the parks, the civic spaces. And they're also part of what makes neighbourhoods work for families. If you got these two things right, then families might, or a couple might choose to have children, but as their children start to grow up, if they can, they will move away unless there are good spaces for their children to enjoy, and they feel that the world outside their front door is safe and welcoming for their children. So the rest of my talk is really focusing on this, the space between buildings and the public space. So here are the cities that I looked at, and I spent about a week in each city interviewing politicians, officers, seeing sites, doing some desk research. And there are 5 cities in Europe: Oslo, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Ghent, and Freiburg, and then 3 municipalities that are all in the greater Vancouver metro area, and Calgary. And the reason I chose these cities was because from the work I've been doing, and I've been engaged in this topic for at least a decade, they were all cities that had taken the idea, taken the goal of becoming more child-friendly seriously. Okay, so they had done more than just a few nice playgrounds or a consultation exercise. They had put some serious resources, whether it's people or money or both, at the municipal level into becoming more child-friendly. So really my focus here is the municipality, because as again we've heard before, it's the municipality that holds so many of the levers that can make places better or worse for children. So for instance, you won't see Copenhagen on this list. Copenhagen is arguably one of the most child-friendly cities on the planet. But interestingly, Copenhagen has not consciously, intentionally done work to become more child-friendly. There's no initiative that's badged up and that says, this is about making Copenhagen more child-friendly. I can tell you this because I heard the chief architect of Copenhagen speak about a year and a half ago, and I asked her about whether she thought it was important to think about children, and she said, yes, yeah, we don't really do that. Maybe we should. And I want to emphasize this because I think one of the things that can sometimes be a bit disheartening for those of us who work in cities that are not very child-friendly is everybody talks about Copenhagen. And you think, oh, well, we're never going to be like Copenhagen. But maybe you are like Ghent or Rotterdam. So I'm now going to do a very quick summary of some of the initiatives that were happening in each of these 9 cities. So, starting with Antwerp, has a really interesting model for improving neighbourhoods for children. So it's a neighbourhood-based analysis, and it looks at spaces and it looks at routes. And the officer who runs this takes one neighbourhood at a time and engages children, gets their views, but also talks to the planners, to the transport people, to figure out how can the money that he's got in his back pocket, which might be €1 million a year, how can he best use that money to open up the neighbourhood for children? So it might be improving a park or a playground or creating a new space, but it might be dealing with a crossing or a public square. So he calls that the kind of play space web approach. It's thinking about a play and child-friendly layer that covers the neighbourhood. So that's Antwerp. Next up is Ghent, also in Flanders, of course. And Ghent also takes that neighbourhood approach, but has managed to build it up into a comprehensive strategy. So in Ghent, there is a team of officers, 3 or 4, who work with different closely with different departments, with transport, with parks, with city development. And the work programme has been pulled together into this action plan for making Ghent a more child-friendly city. And it's pretty ambitious, and certainly if you speak to the planners or the transport people, they will tell you that their politicians tell them always to think about children and young people. So it's really beginning to be strongly embedded in the mainstream work of these departments. Next up is Rotterdam. Rotterdam is interesting. 12 years ago, there was a survey of Dutch cities which showed that Rotterdam was the worst city in the Netherlands to grow up. Okay, that is not a league table that you want to be at the bottom of. So the politicians in Rotterdam realized they had a problem. Families, we've heard this as well, have been leaving the city, especially, families with some money, affluent families, taking their energy and their tax base with them. So Rotterdam decided it needed to do something about it. And a key tool, a key focus was making the city more attractive for families. And it's actually run 2 separate programs over the last 8-9 years, which have been pretty ambitious and involve quite large sums of money. We're talking tens of millions of euros over the course of this program. And I'll say a little bit more about the effect later. Then we have Oslo. Oslo is different and interesting. So Oslo has had a strong focus on mobility. Remember the other axis of children's everyday freedoms, of making somewhere child-friendly. So Oslo has developed an app which thousands of children have on their phone, which is really easy to use and which allows children to give real-time feedback about the problems that they face on their trip to school. So you imagine you're a child and you can see that there's a dangerous crossing, or that there's a tree or a bush that's growing out into the pavement. You can take a photo and you can send the photo to the traffic department. And here's the neat thing, the traffic department actually gets that information and has a budget to be able to do something about it. So it's not just a participation tool, it's an implementation tool. And it's linked to the city's goal of reducing car traffic and promoting walking and cycling in the city. And it's really impressive. I'll say some more about some examples of that a bit later. In terms of my European cities, the final city I visited was Freiburg in Germany. And many of the urbanists in the room will know that Freiburg has been taken forward some really radical and ambitious, sustainable neighborhoods. So this is one, this is Vauban in Freiburg, which has about 10,000 homes and is extremely green, sustainable, very, very low levels of car ownership because it costs an awful lot of money to store, to keep a car. And so the whole of the public realm in this neighborhood is really open for everybody, and it's very child-friendly. You can see that example here. And one of the interesting things about this neighborhood, it was partly shaped, it was informed by a really robust piece of research from the 1990s in Freiburg that studied children's everyday freedoms, that asked children themselves where they play, how they can get around, and that found that the greener neighborhoods and the neighborhoods with the lower traffic were the neighborhoods where more children played out. And so they took those findings and made sure that they were built into this neighborhood and also another neighborhood in Freiburg as well. So you've got 2, you would say, flagship, big residential developments that help us, that give us a kind of compass point about what new developments might need to look like if they're to be really child-friendly. I'm now going to move across the Atlantic Ocean to Canada. And here what we've seen is, firstly, the city of Vancouver, which has really got a long tradition of making their high-density housing, so that the medium and high-rise, more family-friendly. This guidance is from 1992, but the original guidance actually goes back to the 1970s. And there are some really quite interesting high-density neighbourhoods that are still, you would say, at a human scale in Vancouver. This is the city of North Vancouver, so this is another municipality that has developed a strategy. And part of that strategy looks at public spaces and streets. And again, there is an officer who is working with colleagues to implement that strategy. And the same is true of New Westminster, which is a third municipality in the Vancouver metro area. And in each case, there was a local NGO, an advocacy group that was part of this program of work. And then finally, the city of Calgary. Now, any of you who've been to Calgary will know it's probably one of the least child-friendly cities, certainly in the high-income countries. It's sprawling, very car-dependent. But what's interesting about Calgary is the city has secured some external funding, some money from an NGO, to develop a play strategy. So those are my 9 cities. So what did I find? I can feel the excitement in the room as I share with you my first diagram. Here we go. What you're looking at here is, okay, so I was speaking to these politicians and decision makers. Why were you doing what you were doing? What got you concerned about children's experiences of city? And you can see here that broadly speaking, the cities fall under 3 headings. There's a group of cities, quite a large group, that are interested, surprisingly perhaps, in the economy. Okay, actually, that making cities better for children, for them, had a link with the economy of the city. A second group of cities that saw the links between being child-friendly and sustainable. And if you're puzzling here, then it's really quite simple. If we ask ourselves, what does a child-friendly city look like? It looks like a sustainable city. Yes, it's green, it's compact. There's low levels of traffic, high levels of walking and cycling. And so some of the cities have seen those links. And then there's a third group of cities, and you can see some of them overlap, which really started, or part of their interest was more strongly on children's rights, children's well-being, children's health. Now, one of the interesting things about this diagram, most of the cities actually, if you like, tick more than one of those boxes, 2 or even all 3. So that, I think, tells us that maybe some of the cities that are doing interesting things around child-friendliness can see win-wins. They can see benefits for children and benefits for the economy or for the environment. Now, I looked in some detail about what was going on in cities, and my next 2 slides give you some of that detail. They are not going to win any prizes for the best PowerPoint slide in the year competition, but the information is there, so it's just give you a flavour of some of the things I looked at. Lots of numbers, probably hardly read it, and of course it's in English, so sorry about that. But you can see I've pulled out what staffing, what municipal resources were each of these municipalities giving? How much money were they spending? So that information will be there in my final report. And this second slide shows you what I call the ingredients, yes? If you're thinking about a recipe for becoming more child-friendly, what are the ingredients in that recipe? So I looked at about 10 different tools, processes that kept on coming up in different cities. And you can see those there. So here's a flavour of some of the physical changes that we're seeing in these different cities. This is in Antwerp, and we've seen many of these sorts of interventions already today. Improvements to public spaces to make them more playful, whether it's an actual playground or an improvement to a ball court. In Ghent, one thing that I saw was there was a large urban regeneration project in the poorest part of the city. And the child friendly strategy officer worked with her colleagues in regeneration to add a play layer to the whole of this ambitious long-term regeneration. So this is just a couple of examples of improvements to public space. This is a brand new public space, and this you can see is I think you'd call it a home zone, a shared surface street that was created in this neighborhood. In Vancouver, one of the things that's going on, and this is happening in a number of American cities and in European ones, a big emphasis on cycling and promoting cycling, creating cycle infrastructure. But in Vancouver, they talk about all age and ability infrastructure. So they're saying, we want to make sure that our cycleways, our cycle paths, they're not just, you know, for the fit 30-something males, you know, they're all wearing Lycra and have their racing bikes, but that maybe a child who's 8 can use it, or a mother who's got some children in the front of their bike can use it. This picture shows that also one of the side effects often of making really good cycle infrastructure, you close this street and you've created a kind of sort of spontaneous play offer at the same time, because by making the street more benign for cyclists, you also open it up for other uses. And I mentioned Oslo earlier. This is a nice example of how Oslo used that traffic app. Remember the traffic agent app that encourages children to spy on their city, to create a whole new walking route through this woods that connected up a new housing development with a school. And it was the children saying that they were finding it hard to get to the school that created that. And finally, in Rotterdam, this is an example we've seen in a number of cities, including Bogota and Stuttgart, where a car park has been, in fact, we saw it in Amsterdam in a way, a car park has been turned into a playful public space. And again, one of the things that's happening in Rotterdam, unlike many Dutch cities, Rotterdam is, because it was largely destroyed in the Second World War, it became a very car-dependent city. It was built almost like the American cities. And so for the past 10 or 15 years, the city council has been trying to unwind that process and to become, to reduce the level of car use, to take car parking out of the city centre and to encourage walking and cycling. So you can see how this fits. So what difference has all this made? Okay, I've just got 3 quotes for you. 2 are from politicians. It's always interesting to hear what they have to say. Here is the former deputy mayor of Rotterdam, who basically said, you know, we wanted to kind of get more affluent families into our city. Well, it's worked. 10% more in the neighborhoods that they targeted. By the way, this was a targeted program. It raises some tricky questions about what about the other neighborhoods. I'll come back to that later. In one of the cities in Vancouver, we see the mayor actually saying something pretty similar. What he's saying is that in most parts of the metro area, families are moving out of the more urban communities. But in my patch, families are moving into this urban community. So he's seeing more families with school-aged children coming into his municipality. So for him, that's also exactly what he wanted to happen. And my third and final quote, it's not actually from a politician, but it's showing you the kind of thinking and the possible interest that politicians might take. So Gro Hansen, who's a researcher with a federal government institute, talks about politicians can see that arguments about child friendliness can help to sugar the pill. They can help to win people over to the goal of, for instance, tackling car dependence and car dominance. So if you pull all this together, and I sort of mentioned earlier some of the ingredients, I'm now going to share with you, drum roll, my second diagram, and this is the recipe, okay? This is my recipe for becoming a more child-friendly city. And it's a pentagon, everybody. I'm an ex-mathematician. I like sort of mathsy things. So At the heart of this model, it's a hub and spoke model really, and at the heart of the model is a municipal official, somebody whose job it is to get things to happen, and who is maybe not in the city development department, but works alongside colleagues in that department and in transport and in parks to shape and steer the delivery of those departments. And even better if there's a politician behind that person as well. And then you've got these other spoke elements. Investment in spaces and mobility, not one, but both. Meaningful engagement with children, by which I mean, you know, if we're going to ask children what their views are about their city, let's do something about it, let's feed back to them, and let's respond. I've said this already, a focus on residential neighbourhoods, the neighbourhoods where everyday families live their everyday lives. Links to progressive transport and planning policies, and I think that's key. And finally, and actually this is the area where cities are weakest, but I think it's vital, is actually let's figure out if what we're doing is making a difference. Yeah, we need to measure the impact of this stuff. And only a few cities were doing that very well. Rotterdam was doing that quite well. We saw one or two examples of one or two other cities, but in general, of the 9 cities I looked at, probably only 3 or 4 were I think, doing enough on that. So that's my recipe. I just wanted to share with you a couple of other things that are going on in other cities that I think you should be aware of. I think we've already heard mention of this today. I can't remember who it was. But so this is a really interesting, one of a number of interesting programs going on in Barcelona to make the city more sustainable, but also more child-friendly. This is Superblocks, and you can find tons of stuff on the internet about Superblocks as a way of reconfiguring traffic to open up residential areas. Another interesting initiative that's caught my eye, again, very ambitious. The mayor of Paris has declared that she wants to turn all of that city's schoolyards into green public spaces. Okay, every single one. It's going to take her 20 years, she thinks, but that's partly a response to climate change and to the heat island effect that that city is experiencing, because Paris has very little green public space. You know, when you get outside of those lovely parks that you see as a tourist, there isn't a lot of greenery around. So schoolyards are amongst the only public space or outdoor spaces that the mayor can get her hands on and do something with. So she sees a win-win between child friendliness and sustainability. So what other cities are doing stuff? There's a list of a few here. I'm wondering if Prague could be another, or perhaps České Budějovice, or wherever it might be. I know we shouldn't all just talk about Prague the whole time. There's some really interesting things going on. It's still an emerging discipline. This is certainly true. This is not mainstream by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a bit of a head of steam building up behind this idea. One of the examples of that is this program. Really interesting initiative from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, which is a very well-respected NGO. Historically, it's funded work on early childhood, but what it's asking here is, let's think about young children's experiences of living in the city, and let's look at the city from the point of view of a 3-year-old, 95 centimetres. That's where the urban 95 comes. So I think one of the questions for those of us who are making the case for this approach is, are we thinking enough about younger children? And of course, their parents. Because when you've got very young children, they're not independently mobile. Their mobility is dependent on their parents. But we also need to talk more about teenagers, and we heard some questions about that earlier. We're not doing a good enough job in many countries. It's almost as if when children turn 13, they stop being kind of cute and nice and playful, and they start being monsters and kind of pests who we need to eliminate from public space. And that's, well, I'm sure everyone in this room agrees that's problematic, but I hope you, like me, feel we need to take that message beyond this room. There's an open question about how much legislation is needed. I'll come back to that, but it's certainly, we heard the mention of the Welsh place efficiency laws earlier. I think that's potentially powerful, but it wasn't evident in many of the cities that I was seeing that there was a kind of strong legislative component. Maybe that will come. And these two are really connected, but thinking about how does this pan out for poor children, for children who are living in poor areas, for children who have, maybe don't even have basic access to good services. And is there a danger that if you don't have a program that's sensitive to inequality, that essentially the middle classes will get their hands on the money and the resources and the change, and their neighbourhoods will get much nicer, thank you very much, but will leave the poorest neighbourhoods behind. So, a few just thoughts about lessons and insights. I've talked about neighbourhoods first, and play and mobility. Win-wins. I think this is really crucial. I don't think it's very easy or very likely that politicians can just be won over purely from the argument of children's rights. I think it's just one more thing that politicians are going to feel that a lobby group is pushing. But if you connect goals around children's well-being and children's rights to other agendas, which is not difficult to do, then I think you can get the ear of the mayor or the deputy mayor. This is really the big one for me. People before policies. The cities that I saw that were doing interesting things were doing them because there were people who had taken up this issue and run with it. And I can't emphasize that strongly enough. So my advice to any city who came to talk to me would be find that person, find those people. Maybe they're in the municipality, maybe you need to bring them into your municipality and get them to be at the center of that hub and spoke model. And finally, and I'm interested in this idea, this is an idea from Arup, who engineering firm are pretty interested in chunky stuff like infrastructure, to talk about children's infrastructure, a layer of stuff that makes cities work for children, but that isn't just kind of trivial but is like chunky stuff, like green infrastructure or transport infrastructure. So I'm almost finished. I've got one more slide. And really it picks up on a phrase that I think Elga used earlier, which is this idea of spatial justice. A lot of this is about values. It's about who the city is for and who the decision makers are paying attention to. And if we go back to the Dutch, we often think about the Dutch as being just people who love their kids, and they've always done great things, the kind of things that Elga was showing. Elga will know, and in fact you heard this in his talk, this is not the case. In the 70s, there were pitched battles in the streets of Amsterdam and other Dutch cities about who has a claim over the city streets. And I think maybe we need the same kind of advocacy for children today to make the case for them to have a claim on the spatial justice of our cities. Thank you very much. Děkuji.